When they tell you that there's an elephant on your chest and that's what it feels like when you're having a heart attack, they mean it. When I got to the hospital, I had an experience which they were working on me, and that's all I remember until 77 days later when I woke up at Brigham and Women's. I only had 10% heart function at that point. So many things went wrong. I died at least 6 times clinically, where they had to bring me back to life. I'm 37 years old. They're telling me I need a transplant.
Well, transplantation began, of course, with kidney transplantation, and the Peter Bent Brigham Hospital was really the forerunner in doing this operation in the United States.
The first transplant was done at the Brigham Hospital by Joe Murray and his colleagues. It was in 54, 55, and they were the only team in the area doing transplants.
We wanted to be certain that we were doing no harm, because the medical preceptors do no harm, and obviously you're doing potential harm to a donor who is going to be losing an important organ. So we convened and had several meetings with surgeons and physicians from the Brigham and from other hospitals in the Boston area. We wanted to be certain that we were not sort of caught up in the enthusiasm of the venture. We also discussed it with clergymen of all denominations.
It's important to remember that in the very early days, all of the transplants were done from living donors.
After the 54 operation, it took 5 years, until 59, that we were able to transplant across a genetic barrier between brothers. And then in 1962, we were able to take a cadaver kidney out of a person that died at the Brigham, transplant that into a person that needed a transplant.
It became apparent that perhaps we could use non-living donors, and that was obviously a necessity if you were going to go beyond the kidney to the so-called non-paired organs, the heart and the liver and so on.
Before the organ bank was formed, the chances of having an available functioning kidney going to a needy recipient was sort of hit or miss. The recipient hospital had to know that there was someone out there. A person in a potential donor hospital had to know of a facility that might be available to perform transplants.
My friend and supporter, Dr. Francis Moore, over at the Brigham, called me on a Sunday morning. And he said, I've read in the newspaper that there's a patient that you have who may be dying of a head wound. And is it possible that you might be able to speak to the family after death and remove his liver and bring it over to me at the Peter Bent Brigham Hospital? Well, I said yes, of course I would. We removed the liver, we took it over to the Brigham Hospital. I think it was in a taxi cab.
In the whole culture of Boston medicine, there was a competitiveness in essentially all medical activities, and transplantation certainly was one of them.
So the founders were concerned about sharing and having organs available for individuals, that it wouldn't be an institutional province. It would be a community resource.
The founders were really very far-thinking. They were looking ahead, and they were recognizing that individual transplant centers, even though they were very strong competitors, could in fact all do better if they worked together.
We realized that we had to have a listing of patients who would be waiting for organs in all the various hospitals eventually as organ transplantation spread, and that was the beginning.
The first organ bank was the Boston Interhospital Organ Bank, which included the Harvard hospitals and Tufts University and Boston University.
As other hospitals became interested and as the techniques for organ transplantation and the success rate began to improve a little bit, other hospitals naturally felt they should offer this service. And so that began to happen, not only in Massachusetts, but also throughout the New England states, so that gradually it became the New England Organ Bank.
The organ bank was initially a very tiny organization with only 3 individuals working for it, a director and a part-time secretary and then the laboratory director. And it literally was a mom-and-pop operation.
We who are working in the field of transplantation were delighted that there was some attempt to systematize organ procurement because we didn't want to lose the opportunity to help the needy recipients.
An important person at the beginning of this organ bank was Dr. Benjamin Barnes. Dr. Barnes was a surgeon who worked with me at Massachusetts General, and Barnes became the first executive secretary, made things happen.
Initially, there was a relatively equal sort of demand and supply in the very early days. That has far since disappeared, and now we have a situation where the rate of increase of the patients waiting for transplantation by far exceeds the rate of growth of the number of transplants available.
One of the big changes that occurred about the same time as Dr. Barnes' retirement in 1988 was the formal implementation of the national system. In 1984, the National Organ Transplant Act, which was the federal legislation, was enacted, and from that a national system was formed in 1988.
When the task force that was established by the National Organ Transplant Act gave its final report on what an OPO should look like, what they described looked an awful lot like the New England Organ Bank that we had created.
There was a need for this kind of independent organization so that the public could be better educated, so that organ donors were identified in a systematic way outside of the individual transplant centers, so that the tissue typing could be done centrally. And so there was an organization that was focused on organ preservation and the science of organ preservation.
What the organ bank needed in the mid to late 80s was a real board of trustees, a group of knowledgeable, interested, dedicated individuals that could evaluate the circumstances, formulate policy to meet those circumstances, and then oversee the implementation of those policies. We hired Rich, and Rich immediately began to put together the administrative infrastructure that was going to support this organization.